Welcome to the edge of the known, where shadows hold ancient secrets and the very air vibrates with a primal dread. Tonight, we journey to the Whisperwind Mire, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a boundary between our world and something far older, something unseen. If you're ready to delve into a tale where the silence is broken by guttural croaks and the darkness hides unimaginable forms, then be sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Join me as we explore a horror that rises from the depths, a terror that remembers. Prepare to feel the cold, wet embrace of the mire. Let's begin. The Whisperwind Mire had always been a place of hushed reverence and unspoken dread in the small town of Oakhaven. Locals whispered tales of strange lights flickering amongst the cypress knees, of unsettling moans carried on the stagnant air, and of those who had ventured too deep, never to return. It was a place avoided after dusk, a natural boundary between the familiar and the fearfully unknown. My grandfather, old Silas, had always warned me away from the mire. The Whisperwind remembers, he'd croak, his eyes clouded with a distant terror, and what it remembers, it eventually claims. I'd dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, his mind steeped in local folklore. But after he passed and left me, his secluded cabin bordering the mire's edge, a subtle unease began to take root. The cabin itself was rustic but sturdy, nestled amidst a tangle of ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss. The days were peaceful, filled with the drone of cicadas and the croaking of unseen frogs. But as twilight descended, a different atmosphere permeated the air. The familiar sounds of the forest would gradually fade, replaced by an unsettling silence that felt thick and expectant. It began with subtle disturbances, a faint rustling in the dense reeds at the edge of the mire that didn't sound like any animal I knew. A fleeting glimpse of something moving in the murky depths, something large and indistinct that vanished before I could properly focus. These were sensory whispers, easily dismissed as tricks of the fading light and an overactive imagination. But then came the sounds, low, guttural croaks that seemed to resonate from the heart of the mire, deeper and more resonant than any frog. Sometimes, carried on the still night air, I would hear a faint, almost musical sigh, a sound that held a strange, melancholic beauty, yet sent a shiver of primal fear down my spine. It sounded ancient, otherworldly. One evening, as a thick fog rolled in from the mire, swallowing the trees and turning the familiar landscape into a ghostly labyrinth, I saw it. A light, unlike any natural phenomenon. It pulsed with a soft, ethereal glow, weaving through the fog-laden cypress trees. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the flickering of fireflies. This light seemed to have an intelligence, a deliberate movement that sent a cold tendril of dread coiling in my stomach. As I watched, frozen by a mixture of fear and morbid fascination, the light dipped below the surface of the murky water and disappeared, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the fog. That night, the sounds were closer. The guttural croaks echoed just beyond my cabin walls, accompanied by a soft, dragging sound, as if something heavy was moving through the mud and reeds. A sense of profound unease settled over me, a feeling that something ancient and unseen was aware of my presence, drawn to the warmth of my fire, the vulnerability of my solitude. I lay in bed, the thin wooden walls seeming like no protection at all, listening to the unsettling symphony of the mire, the unseen moving within its depths, and a terrifying question forming in my mind. What else remembers? And what does it want? Sleep offered no solace. The sounds of the previous night, the guttural croaks, the dragging sound, the unsettling musical sigh echoed in my mind. Long after the sun had risen, the faint, ethereal light I'd seen weaving through the fog felt less like a mere visual anomaly and more like a predatory gaze. The warmth of the morning sun did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within my bones. A constant knot of anxiety tightened in my chest, making each breath feel shallow and insufficient. The subtle disturbances of act, I became bolder, more persistent. The rustling in the reeds at the mire's edge was no longer just a fleeting sound. I would catch glimpses of the reeds themselves swaying violently when there was no wind, bending and snapping as if something immense was pushing through them, just below the surface. The glimpses of movement in the murky water were more defined, now large, dark shapes, undulating just beneath the surface, creating disturbing ripples that spread towards the shore. The cabin itself felt increasingly invaded. That faint, earthy, decaying smell from the mire began to seep indoors, clinging to the air, particularly strongest near the windows and the old stone hearth. I'd find inexplicable trails of damp, dark mud leading from the back door towards the mire, even on days I hadn't gone outside. They were too large, too smeared to be from a small animal. My skin crawled constantly, a legion of phantom insects tracing unsettling paths across my limbs. The sounds from the mire evolved, becoming more complex and terrifying. The guttural croaks sometimes seemed to arrange themselves into a rhythm, a slow, deliberate sequence that felt almost like a rudimentary form of communication. The musical sigh would return, but now it was often followed by a low, mournful moan that resonated with a profound, ancient sorrow, yet sent shivers of pure terror down my spine. And the dragging sound was more frequent, sometimes accompanied by a heavy slosh that suggested something massive was pulling itself through the thick mud and water, moving relentlessly towards the cabin. One afternoon, a thick, unnatural silence fell over the surrounding woods, a silence more terrifying than any noise. The birds stopped singing, the cicadas fell quiet, even the ever-present drone of unseen insects vanished. It was a silence that felt like being the only person left in the world, utterly exposed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the vacuum of sound. Looking out the window, I saw the trees standing unnaturally still, their branches devoid of any movement, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. My gaze was drawn to the edge of the Whisperwind Mire, where the reeds stood tall and motionless. And then I saw it again, the soft, ethereal light, pulsing just above the surface of the water, but closer this time, much closer to my property line. It hovered there for a long moment, its glow seemingly fixed on the cabin, before slowly sinking back into the murky depths. That night, the sounds were not just close, they were right outside. The guttural croaks and the mournful moans came from the darkness surrounding my cabin, punctuated by that sickening slosh and drag sound that seemed to circle the perimeter. I barricaded the doors and windows, my hands shaking so violently I could barely latch the old bolts. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like an attempt to breach my fragile defenses. Through a crack in the old wooden blinds, I peered out into the inky blackness. The fog had returned, thick and swirling, reducing visibility to mere feet. But illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the mist, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Imprinted in the damp earth, just outside my window, were large, three-toed tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they led from the edge of the mire directly towards my cabin. The mud within the tracks was still wet, glinting faintly in the dim light. Something large, something ancient, had come out of the Whisperwind Mire, and it had been standing right outside my window in the dead of night, leaving its horrifying mark upon the earth, a silent, terrifying promise of its presence. The mire was no longer just a place of whispers and unseen movement. It was reaching out, and its embrace felt cold, wet, and utterly monstrous. The tracks outside my window were undeniable proof. The unseen in the Whisperwind Mire was no longer content to remain within its murky depths. It was aware of me, it was coming closer, and the primal fear that had been simmering within me finally boiled over into a paralyzing terror. Sleep was an impossibility. Every shadow in the cabin seemed to writhe with unseen life. Every creak of the old wood sounded like the approach of something monstrous. The stench of decay and damp earth was overpowering, clinging to the back of my throat, a constant reminder of the Maya's encroaching presence. The sounds intensified, becoming bolder and more aggressive. The guttural croaks were now loud and insistent, often accompanied by a series of sharp, clicking sounds that sent shivers down my spine. The mournful moans were replaced by guttural growls, low and menacing, that vibrated through the floorboards. The dragging and sloshing sounds were constant, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Sometimes, a heavy thud would resonate against the walls, as if something large was testing the integrity of my fragile sanctuary. One night, the ethereal light returned, no longer a distant glow, but a pulsating orb just outside my window, casting eerie, dancing shadows within the cabin. It seemed to peer into the darkness, its soft luminescence illuminating the damp tracks that now crisscrossed the muddy ground around the cabin. As I watched, frozen in terror, the light slowly rose, revealing a portion of the creature that held it aloft. It was a sinuous, dark shape, slick with mire, its form vaguely serpentine, but with grotesque, elongated limbs that ended in those same three-toed feet. I couldn't make out any distinct features, only a sense of immense size and an ancient, unknowable malevolence. The light pulsed again, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw two glowing pinpricks within the darkness of its form, fixated directly on me. The attack began subtly. A series of violent shudders ran through the cabin, as if something immense was pressing against the walls. The windows rattled in their frames, and the old wooden door bowed inward with a groan. Then came the tearing, a high-pitched, splintering sound, as something ripped through the wooden planks of the outer wall. A cold, damp gust of air rushed into the cabin, carrying the overwhelming stench of the mire. Huddled in the center of the room, clutching a rusty axe I'd found in the shed, I could hear it moving around the exterior, its heavy body dragging against the wood, the clicking sounds echoing just inches from my head. The ethereal light flickered through the widening cracks in the walls, casting grotesque shadows that danced and mocked me in the darkness. Then the floorboards beneath me began to groan and splinter. The dragging sound was directly beneath me now, accompanied by a wet, sucking noise. Panic seized me, a primal urge to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The mire had surrounded me, its unseen horror closing in. The last thing I saw, as the floorboards finally gave way, was the soft, ethereal light rising from the darkness below, illuminating a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The last thing I heard was a deafening, guttural croak, followed by a wet, sucking sound, as I plunged into the cold, black embrace of the whisperwind mire. The mire remembers, and now it had claimed another. The cabin stood silent once more, the only evidence of my existence, the widening hole in the floor, and the lingering, cloying scent of the ancient, unseen horror that lurked beneath the still, dark waters.